Okay, I've got confirmation that we've got audio, so thank you. So, welcome today. As I mentioned, I'm Chris O'Brien, and I'm going to take us through a webinar about the certification, IEC 61508 certification for mechanical devices. And I'm a partner with FMEDA, and FMEDA works with organizations, end users, and manufacturers to develop and implement high reliability, high availability safety systems. And we've got offices around the world and offer a variety of services. And from kind of look at this slide, we provide consulting for end users and manufacturers. We provide product certification to IEC 61508 and also to cybersecurity standards, ISA Secure. We have a wide breadth of training programs available. We make software tools to help do the analysis. Excellency is one of our most popular tools. We have reference books, and we offer a certified functional safety expert or certified functional safety practitioner training and testing. So with that brief introduction, just wanted to cover a few of the resources. We do have a very broad selection of books and even a book on final elements. So with that little background, let's kind of get into the meat of the presentation. There's a lot of talk in the last couple of years about safety, safety instrumented systems, SIL levels, IEC standards 61508 and IEC 61511. And there's a lot of knowledge out there, but there's still a little bit of confusion. So I'm going to go through kind of the basics of the standard and then get into details on how that would affect assessment of mechanical devices. So the IEC standards are essentially consensus standards in that they were formed by an international body, and different countries and regions of the world have adopted them. So IEC 61508, IEC stands for International Electrotechnical Commission, and that standard was written by a group of experts with representation from literally dozens of countries. And that's been adopted as the umbrella standard or main functional safety standard for automated systems. If we look at what's the goal of functional safety, the functional safety goal, and it's that an automatic safety function will perform the intended functionality correctly, or that the system will fail in a predictable, which means safe manner. So it's realized that you can't have perfect safety or perfect reliability, but in those cases when you don't have that, if the system can fail in a safe mode, in an enunciated safe mode, that's good. The key standards that we're going to look at are IEC 61508, and that's essentially the umbrella standard, and then the process industry specific or derivative standard, and that is IEC 61511, or in North America, or specifically the US, ISA 84. ISA 84 and IEC 61511 are identical standards, except for one clause in S84. So we can speak about IEC 61511 and address really the entire world. Now, the standards are performance-based, not prescriptive, and that means that while some standards, such as fire protection standards, an example of that would be NFPA in the U.S., are prescriptive in that they tell you how you must do, say, the valve configuration for fuel shutoff. NFPA 85 will tell you you need to have redundant block valves and a bleed valve. IEC 61511 would not say that. It would say you need to determine the amount of risk you have, and then you need to design a system that would get you below your tolerable risk. So it's a performance-based standard. It also introduces the safety life cycle, which is kind of flows through the entire life of a product or a process, from the concept to designing the functions to maintaining the functions to ultimately decommissioning the functions. And it's got the safety life cycle. And essentially, functional safety management governs the activities associated with the equipment and process safety as it involves correct functioning of specific safety systems. So essentially, what that really means is, if you've targeted and decided you need an automated protective system, then these standards apply over the whole life cycle of that system to ensure that the system is properly designed, properly implemented, and properly maintained, and that it can perform its safety function, which is protection against the unwanted outcome happening. Now, IEC 61508, I mentioned, was an umbrella standard in that it's written not to a specific industry. It's written providing guidance on the safety life cycle, guidance on reliability analysis, both hardware and software, guidance on how to do validation. So that is typically targeted, normally that is applied to an equipment manufacturer. And then there are derivative standards, as they're called. IEC 61513 applies the principles of 61508 to the nuclear industry. IEC 62061 applies the principles to the machinery industry. IEC 61511 applies those principles to the process industry. So those are the derivative standards, or the industry-specific standards. Now, we tracked since early in the 2000s kind of the adoption of these standards. So you can see by 2005, the vast majority of end users, process industry customers, were using IEC 61511. Now, prior, kind of the timeline is in 1998, and a part of IEC 61508 was released, and then the final version, or the complete version of Draft 1, was released in 2000. So even once that was available, some end users started to adopt it and use it, and then very late 2003, really just around the end of the year, beginning of 2004, IEC 61511 was adopted. So then that really, there was a significant pickup in the adoption of that. So the industries covered by IEC 61511 include oil and gas, refining, chemical, power, pharmaceutical, all of your kind of classic process industries. The adoption by the process industry of IEC 61511 is really driving the demand for certified equipment, IEC 61508 certified equipment. And we'll get into why that isn't right now. So, critical issues identified and required by IEC 61511 include the definition of the project requirements, which include the safety life cycle, protective measures against random failures, and protective measures against systemic failures. The need for fault tolerance for the system to be able to survive a failure, and also which surviving the failure drives the redundancy requirements, and then also independence between an event that could cause the hazard and something designed to protect it. And then the thing that's driving the IEC 61508 certification is the standard requires proven in use or IEC 61508 assessment for all equipment used in a safety instrumented system. So a proven in use is a method that an end user can use to look at their installed base and justify using that product in a safety application. Or an IEC 61508 assessment is something that a manufacturer does to provide and demonstrate the strength against random and systemic failures to the user. And it also, final thing is 61511 requires requirement management. What's required of the safety function? How do you determine that? And then how do you ensure you've met it? So if you think about, if you've got a process plant and you're trying to achieve a certain level of safety, you can think about the requirements in the standard as the elements of a bridge. You've got certain things that, certain core concepts that are really the pillars or the towers, and that would be planning, systemic failure protection, and random failure protection. And then there are many steps that have to be done throughout a project that provide the support cables. And that includes safety management, risk assessment, sill selection. All of these individual steps are things that would be done and implemented by an end user doing a system. In a nutshell, to achieve compliance, three criteria need to be met when you're doing an analysis. The system needs to meet architectural constraints. It needs to meet a probability of failure calculation, and it needs to have a certain sill capability, meaning the strength against a systemic fault is strong enough. So it's only when these three things are met that are shown in the center area that you can say a system or a product or a system is compliant with the requirements of IEC 61508 or IEC 61511. Now, IEC 61508 is written for E/E/PE systems. And what that stands for is electrical, electronic, or programmable electronic systems. So an obvious question is, well, why is it applicable for mechanical products then, if it's focused on essentially electric or electronic systems? The key is that is given in this next part, that the standard is concerned with the electrical, electronic, and programmable electronic safety-related systems. It also provides the framework within which safety-related systems based on other technologies may be considered. So it could be applied to purely a complete system that was mechanical, or in reality, the main driver is anything within the safety function, any element that has to operate correctly within the safety function needs to be included. So it'd be fine if the pressure transmitter and the safety PLC were so certified, but that doesn't do your whole loop. Let's say you had impulse lines on the safety transmitter, and then you had a solenoid valve, but then a pneumatic actuator connected to a valve. Well, success isn't achieved unless everything from the impulse lines through the valve works correctly. So therefore, 61508 is applied to all the elements of the safety instrumented function, including those that may be mechanical in nature. So that's why it encompasses everything. Safety integrity level, or SIL, can be applied three ways when you're talking about a SIL rating. It can be applied to talk about the risk reduction requirements placed on the system by the end users or by the application. It can be used to set the probabilistic limits for random hardware failure. And it can be used to establish engineering procedures to prevent systemic failures. Additionally, 61508 can be applied at many levels. It could be applied to a component, a product, or a system. So a component could be a transducer. It could be a software operating system. A product is most typically where we see it applied, and that could be on a transmitter, on a valve, on a PLC, or it could be provided at a system level. Now, this typically happens when there isn't an industry-specific standard. So we looked at the slide earlier that showed the adoption of IEC 61511. Prior to 61511 being introduced, some people applied IEC 61508 and evaluated their safety instrumented functions for the process industry. Just late last year, a functional safety standard for automobiles was released, ISO 26262. Prior to that, many car companies used IEC 61508 to evaluate their safety functions. And as an example, a safety function in a car could be the braking system, could be the steering system, could be the park assist system. So, and again, in that case, it's an automated system with embedded electronics doing a function that, if that function doesn't behave properly, could cause an accident or could make the car unsafe. Now, if we look at what's kind of some of the fundamental things that are within IEC 61508, we'll see requirements for a detailed engineering process that drives design reliability, and requirements for probabilistic performance modeling or analysis that drive hardware reliability. The engineering process requirements are geared towards eliminating if possible, but minimizing sources of systemic faults, design mistakes essentially. The probabilistic performance modeling is designed at managing and making sure that the random failure rates are within tolerable bounds. So an example of a systemic fault is a valve manufacturer. They were producing valves for over 20 years. There was a new version of their CAD software. They used CAD for it. They got the new version, updated, and after about 2 years, they received a customer complaint that their valves did not close on demand. The valve was stuck open. Fortunately, there was another safety function in the plant that shut down the process. The valve was removed, returned to the manufacturer, worked perfectly fine. After some additional investigation, it was found that the drawings for the parts that went into the valve had incorrect tolerances. And so there was an import function from the drawing software to the tool, and the tolerances were incorrect in that function in the newer version of software. So the manufacturer had to add qualification tests for new software tools, and that's an example of a systemic fault that there's an engineering process in place, there's a reliable tool being used, but then there's a change in that tool set that introduces an error. And a systemic fault is a fault that can be only corrected by a change in process or procedure. So essentially every valve that went out would have that tolerance error in it, or you can also think of a systemic fault as if it happens, then every device will have that same weakness. So 61508 has many requirements for the design review, testing, and documentation. Compliance with the requirements reduces design mistakes and improves process safeties. And there are some requirements in 61508 that would not be applicable for a mechanical device or a Type A device, such as a software development process, because there is no embedded software. But management of tools, verification of changes, that would be applicable. A random fault would be a fault of, a random fault relates to a failure of a component occurring randomly during the normal life of a product. Now every component's going to have, no component, no element has a zero failure rate, zero random failure rate. So the failure could be settling of a spring, it could be rupturing of a diaphragm, it could be binding of a valve stem, and the goal is to minimize random faults in the design, but realizing you can't get rid of all of them. So if you can minimize them and then additionally add diagnostics, you can turn them from undetected faults into detected faults. And then the key thing is, where do you get data for random faults? Historically, the source of that data would have been cycle testing and field failure studies. And there's a couple challenges to each of those approaches. Mechanical cycle testing is fine to determine the life, how many cycles of a product, but that really is a wear out mode. It's not a random failure mode. So be careful to be sure that anything you might see or use has not been qualified based on cycle testing, because it's going to have an extremely low failure rate, which is not going to be indicative of the performance of a device in a process application. An example of that is if you had a solenoid and you cycle tested a solenoid, you would get basically determine the wear out for the O-rings or whatever part was going to fail first. But the failure mode in a process application is that O-ring is sitting there, it's energized for a year or 2 years or 3 years and doesn't cycle, and then you get binding due to cold welding of the elastomer and the metal parts. So you've got a different, the failure modes in a low demand process application are very different than what you're going to find in cycle testing, which is basically the wear out point. Field failure studies are another thing that adds some useful information but shouldn't be used directly unless it's an end user with a large population and a rigorous data collection model. Because most manufacturers do a very good job of collecting and storing their data for field returns, but they only know what's returned. They don't know, one, if the end user didn't find the failure, or even if they did find a failure, they may not have reported it because they considered it out of warranty, or it was an inexpensive device that wasn't worth filing and returning it. So field failure studies are very useful. Down here I have a histogram showing different failure modes for a specific product that were returned. So you can get a kind of a modal distribution, but you wouldn't want to use that for an absolute number of failure rate. A method that's in 61508 and it's the dominant method used is failure modes, effect, and diagnostic analysis, where basically you break the product down into individual components and then you use a database of failure rates for components. So for example, you can imagine that it's much simpler to get the failure rate of a resistor or the failure rate of a spring or the failure rate of a diaphragm in different operational modes, use categories, publish that data, have people evaluate it, kind of come to a consensus, than it would be to get the failure rates for all the many variations of how these products can be put together. So the FMEDA technique takes component failure rates and failure modes, and essentially you build the product out of that. So there's different approaches, and we'll call, we can take the cycle method and call it an idealized method, where you said there's nothing, essentially it eliminates random failure rates and assumes kind of a perfect condition, and you wind up with very low predicted failure rates compared to observed failure rates. The other extreme, you could take, you could take generic ones, which are, there have been some generic reliability studies, such as ORITA and RAIC, and you wind up with what's can only be described by saying that there's a lot of failure modes that really aren't pure random failure modes in there, such as wear out and unknown things like was the environmental application correct and all that, and they tend to drive extremely high failure rates, leading to pessimistic PFDs. And then kind of through the studying, there's a lot, the FMEDA results have been kind of correlated to match and be traceable to actually observed field experience. This chart here shows the whole range of failure rates that you can find for a solenoid valve. So from an idealized method, there was a report that says the failure rate for a solenoid valve is 0.43 fits. The pretty much accepted failure rate for a single resistor is 1 fit. So this whole assembly, this whole valve assembly and coil was half of that in this one report of a resistor, which isn't credible. Then there were some generic studies that showed the solenoid failure rate was between 10,000 and 100,000 fits, and that would mean that the mean time to fail dangerously would be on the order of 2 years, which again isn't really reasonable. Then there's a whole different, depending on the complexity of the solenoid valve, there's solenoid failure rates everywhere between maybe 80 fits and up to 900 fits, depending on the complexity of the valve. And when you compare that to observed failures in the field, that becomes pretty reasonable. And the key to that, key to driving those reasonable results, is the component database. So the FMEDA technique was designed by some engineers who weren't at Exit at the time. They were at another organization about 20 years ago. And by using component failure rates for components and those failure rate distributions, you can create an FMEDA which gives you product failure rates, product failure modes, and diagnostic coverage. And the FMEDA gives you a lot of information that you need for the IEC 61508 standard, including failure rates per failure mode, diagnostic coverage of tests such as partial valve stroke testing, and the failure rates for partial valve stroke testing, diagnostic coverage of fill stroke manual testing, and lifetime limits of components. So it gives you a report with the data you need to meet the requirements of 61508. If we take just a little look into how you would do an FMEDA, here's just part of an FMEDA for a butterfly valve. And you see that there are components, body, the seat that's part of the body in this particular valve, and the disc. So we're only looking at a couple parts here. There's a component. What is it? It's a valve components, butterfly. Use category, typical materials. What are the failure modes? So there for the body, we have bind and minor leak. So a binding would be dangerous. A minor leak would be external. How many parts? What's the failure rate? And lambda is essentially the failure rates are given in failures per billion hours. What's the distribution? Any remarks? And could you find it? So if we look here, if we look down, say, on the disc, we could have bind, break, minor leak, major leak. And in this case, we've got 720 fits, the distribution, 10%, 5%, 70%, 15%. Is it a dangerous failure, and I don't care failure? And would a diagnostic find it? So here it's saying, if you've got binding, we're going to give 60% credit for a partial valve stroke test and 90% for a full valve stroke test. If you've got leakage, well, a stroke test isn't going to tell you anything about leakage, so then you don't get any credit for it. And then you just sum it up, and that's how you get you sum up the results for all the parts in the product, and you get the results at a product level. Now, the accuracy of the FMEDA depends on the accuracy of the component database. So it must include failure rates and failure modes distribution for each component, and the useful life of each component also must be documented. So where do you get the data? So there's a lot of databases available out there for electronics, the Siemens database, MILF databases, Bellcore, IEC 62380, but not really for mechanical. So what we've been doing at Exeter for the last 10 years is collecting data. So you start with some expert opinion, look at field failure studies that you can get a product failure rate from. You've got field studies, you've got industry databases, you can get a product failure rate. You can go from this database, generate an FMEDA, compare them to that, and see how well does the predicted match field experience. If there are significant differences, you dig into it and you update the component database. So we've got over 10 billion operational hours that we studied. So we have over 200 field studies with over 10 billion hours, and the database has evolved and really been refined and become quite stable over the last probably 4 to 5 years. And we continue to do this. We do this on every certification project. But the data is very stable, and the data is configured or set up to have a 30 to 50% safety factor, because you can't account for everything, so you want to be somewhat on the conservative side. We publish that data both for the electronic and the mechanical in our electrical and mechanical component reliability handbook, so people can use it to do their own analysis, or they can look at it and say, hey, you know what, I really think that this number is not representative for these reasons. So if we talk about if we switch to thinking about a 61508 certification, the complete certification, what are the milestones? Well, first, the hardware has to meet the PFD average of the target SIL, so you've got to have essentially low failure. The lower your failure rates, the more fail-safe your design, the better, and the higher or better your diagnostic coverage also is good. It must meet safe failure fraction requirements for the SIL target. If there's software, the software has to meet the requirements for systemic fault avoidance. In addition, and even if there is no software, the general development process has to meet those requirements. The product has to meet the general process requirements for the target SIL for systemic fault avoidance, and you've got to generate some documentation such as the safety manual for users. How does that impact a product development process? Well, first, you've got to have a documented safety life cycle. It's got to be written down. It's got to be followed. You need requirements for the safety-related functions of the device. You need a safety-related validation plan. You need a defined architecture. These next 3 bullets, which are grayed out, if you've got software now, a mechanical device such as, or often final elements are type A and have no software. So in 61508, a type A device is a simple electrical mechanical device. A type B would be something that had software or an ASICs or things like that in it. So often a final element is type A, but sometimes it could be a smart valve positioner. It could be part of the final element, or an electric actuator with lots of software in it. So there may be times that the software requirements of 61508 apply, and that's what's in gray. So you need a qualified set of tools, you need a coding standard, you need to follow the coding standard, and you need to kind of have a compliant process. And then finally, whether it's type A or type B, you need to verify compliance to the coding standard if there's software, but if there's not, you still need to verify compliance to the design guides and design rules you've done. So if we look at kind of a typical flow, you would have a project plan, product requirements, and these, you might generate a functional safety management plan, a safety requirement spec. Then you would decompose, whether you're making a valve or an actuator, you would have a list of requirements, and it might be R1, could be CV requirement, could be torque requirement, could be sealing requirements. Excuse me. So for each of those safety-related requirements, you would do a design and you would have a test to show that requirement was met. Often with valves or mechanical products, you'll do it in engineering, but the production test also will validate the function. So it's kind of why you might do verification in engineering, where you do qualification and your general design and validate each unit before it goes out the door. You would generate document required, such as the safety manual. You'd have a management of change process. Those would include field return analysis, internal change requests, customers' requests, controlling of purchasing parts, and then finally obsolescence. So that might be, a simplified functional safety management plan, in a visual way for a valve or an actuator or a solenoid. Then if we looked at what would it take, what happens with certification, this is kind of a typical list of documents, or a document similar to that would need to exist or be added to your plan. So you need a functional safety management procedure. You need to document. So you need, your functional safety management plan, development procedure, safety requirements spec. Now, some of these things, the standard doesn't require you to have specific IEC 61508 documents, but it does require that the intent or the things called out for in these documents exist. So you might have a general development process that meets the requirements of IEC 61508. Your general product spec might meet the requirements or meet the criteria of a safety requirement specification. But you can see as you walk through this, there's quite a few documents required, and they go through everything from product conceptualization to design to validation to manufacturing and maintenance. A typical certification project looks like this. There's a project start, and then there's kind of a branch that would go down evaluating the random strength of the product. And then there's a branch that's looking at the systemic strength, and they kind of meet up in the safety case. So the FMEDA would give failure rates for a product. The gap analysis and training and baseline safety case would provide training, collect documentation showing that systemically the development process and management process was in place to meet 61508. And then there'd be assessment. Typical OEM documents, that list previously is kind of the exhaustive list, but you'd need your functional safety management plan, your safety requirement spec, your validation plan, tool justification for any tools used, and a safety manual. And that would be kind of a simple overview of an assessment process. Timeline could be anywhere from 3 to 6 months for a device. And usually the gap analysis and the FMEDA are done in parallel, and then the safety case is completed, and after that, with the final site audit and final safety case at the end of the project. If you're successful, you would get a certificate documenting the product, and what SIL level was achieved. end users are, what's kind of the trend of that is end users are increasingly adopting IEC 61511, and that's driving the need for certified examples because, as I mentioned before, to implement 61511, you have to either do a proven in use analysis or use products that have been assessed to 61508. So that's driving a demand in an increase of safety-related equipment. And in general, we haven't updated this for the last 2 years, but if we look at certified products, and these were measuring devices, but you can see it just continues to increase, and I can tell you it has continued to increase like that. So more and more of the industry is implementing or supplying certified products. Kind of examples, if we looked at a solenoid valve, ASCO, bifold, Versa, and many others have SIL 3 capable. So they've done it by establishing a hardware development process that meets SIL 3, demonstrating test results, proving good design process, creating a safety manual, explaining the usage of the product, and using an FMEDA analysis with fault injection, testing and field study to demonstrate the random failures are accurate. If you want to get an idea of what's out there, we keep a list of what we call our safety automation equipment list on our website, and we list all products, whether we've certified them or a TV has certified them. Any product with what we would say is a credible certification we have on this list, and you can search for it by sensor, logic solver, final element, and then by type. So you can get a feel for, if you're an end user, you can find certified products out there. If you're an OEM, you can see what's going on in your particular market space. So this one is for ball valves. This is a snapshot for, I think this is, okay, this is just the full list for the ball, well, the full list at the time for the ball valves. Our certification program reviews the design process assessment, essentially ensuring that all the applicable requirements of IEC 61508 are met, and demonstrating the adequate system integrity, which can be done by a combination of proven use and process, and the FMEDA, which is often supported by a fault injection test. And a fault injection test essentially is if you claim, if a diagnostic is claimed, then you need to insert that fault. You insert the fault that the diagnostic would cover and demonstrate that the diagnostic works. But in that case, if you do that, you can take credit for diagnostics which take dangerous failures and make them dangerous detected as opposed to dangerous undetected. We are an accredited, we have A-class accreditation from ANSI to IEC 17025 for doing assessments. We use a safety case tool that we've developed that essentially lists all the requirements of the standard, and for a project then we would go through each thing and create an argument as to why the specific company or product met those requirements. And essentially when that's all done, the safety case is done, including storing evidence documents in the safety case. So kind of the project engineer would work with the OEM, collect this, coach them on it, and then accumulate all the evidence documents, store them in the safety case, and then the assessor can come in and take a look at that, take a look at the arguments, do the audit, and review and confirm that everything is appropriate and covered. If not, then there would be a finding. If it is, then it would be completed. So Exida has really excellent competencies. We've got staff members who are active members of IEC 61508. We've been involved since the 1990s. We helped write the standard. We've developed some of the analysis techniques used in there. For example, the FMEDA analysis, which was developed, in the early 90s and has been adopted by the industry. We've taught courses to other agencies, including some of the TV companies. Some of the TV companies license our tools and analysis software, and we include many people that were either in product development at OEMs, at assessing companies like TUVs, or with end users. So we've got a very nice blend of expertise. Oh, got a Q&A question. How often? So the question is, there was a question: how often do we update the component reliability? We update it. We update the book, the printed book, every probably on a 2 or 3 year cycle. We add components as we identify that they're needed. So a component that, or a failure mode, or components that, like on the electronic side, that had been added maybe in the last 5 years were small geometry microcontrollers with small geometry memory storage. And small geometry means a submicron, a very small distance between the gates, such that background radiation can change the state of the gate. So that needed to be added into the book. As we find different uses or modes, so for a mechanical part, originally we would have a valve body. We now have a typical valve body, which would be such as like an investment casting valve body, and then we have what we would call a vacuum cast or wrought valve body, which would have a lower failure rate, less chance of porosity, more even material flow resulting in less stress concentrations. So that we do as we identify new, what we would call use cases for a part. The printed book gets updated every 2 or 3 years, and we have an update due out mid this year. But the database that's used in our FMEDA tool is continually updated as we add new parts. More questions? Okay. Okay. One question is, there are not many reliability data certifications about electrical relay. Do you have any information on FMEDA studies? That's a very, very true. There's some general numbers for a relay. There are some smart relays that have been done, but they're more like a Type B smart relay. Nicolo, if you want to send me an email, I can try to get you some information. I'll give you the guidance that we typically use, and we typically have generic number. We have a generic relay failure rate, and then we also have, and we can take this discussion offline. But then you look at the mode. So the prime failure mode, or a prime failure mode of a relay, one would be the coil failing or opening, so that would be typically safe if it's de-energized to trip, or the contacts welding. So if you do some type of current protection of that relay, you can justify using a lower failure rate. But shoot me an email, and I think my email is at the bottom of the screen, and I'd be happy to get you some more information. I saw one question come and go, which was, should a motor control center be Type A or Type B? And that would depend on if it's purely, if it's kind of a coil pulling in a contactor, then, and there can be discrete electronic circuitry, then that's Type A. If it's a smart motor controller that's got software and components kind of conditioning that signal and controlling inrush currents and that type of thing, then it's probably a Type B. Again, if you shoot me an email or a little bit about the product, I could give you a more definitive answer. I don't have anything for louvered dampers. Andrew, again, I could help you if you send me just a note or show me the product. We do have actuators. We haven't done, I don't know of anybody that's done dampers. We've done different types of actuators and feedback things for linear positioning, but I haven't seen somebody do the damper yet. Okay, what's the difference between a Type B device and a Type B element? Essentially, I'm going to answer this in two parts. So one, Type A is a simple device where all the failure modes are known and well documented. So basically here in that mechanical and discrete electronic parts. Device and element, there's been, in my opinion, there's a little bit of confusion, a little bit different way of talking about things in the new version of 61508, where they're breaking an element down. I forget the exact definition, but you could take an element, could be a solenoid, or you could take it down to it's a microcontroller on a board. So, and it has to do with how you would apply the safe failure fraction. So that is the one thing that I would say that's in the new version of the 61508 standard that needs a little more time to sort out. And that's, well, because you can kind of apply it, not as you would like, but you can apply it, if you read it verbatim, you really can start even just breaking up your product in between, and different parts of your product would be Type A or Type B, which I think is a little bit confusing, and it's a little bit arbitrary because you could wind up with different targets for a device depending on how you kind of categorize the subparts of it. So an element, classically, I would say a device is something such as a valve or an actuator, and an element in 61508 would be a lower level component in that. Different in like ISO 26262, they talk about an element being, well, I guess I would know, in 26262, which is automotive, that's how they talk about it as well. It's but they don't really talk about subsystems in that. They talk about elements that make up a system. So, Jill, I know that's not a very clear explanation because there is, I think there's a little bit of muddied water now with the new way the standard's talking about it. But I'd be happy to follow up with an email as well. So, so our experience, we've done an awful lot of certifications, really more than anybody else. We've done, about almost 70% of all certifications done for field instruments for valving, valves and actuators. So over 100 out of 150 as of almost a year ago. So we should update this. But if anything, our percentages have grown. I mentioned we were accredited by ANSI. So we have to kind of go through the same thing we ask our customers to go through. One more question. Do we have failure rates for inverters failing to a high frequency? So this, I think that in the electromechanical reliability handbook, we have. I'd have to check that, but I think we do because that would be a failure mode. Are you? And I guess the question, maybe the follow-up would be: are you looking at a component on a board, or are you looking at a device? A device. So I think we've got them for components, and then if you're looking at almost thinking of an AC power module or something, you would do an FMEDA on the module and get those failure rates for the module. Lots of resources, books and training and consulting and certification. We have some training coming up in the U.S. over the next couple months. I know a lot of folks are in the U.S., a lot of folks aren't, but this is all on our website. So if you want to take a look at that, and that's kind of the last. We're doing just fine on time. So I guess I would ask if there's any other questions, and thank you for attending, but I've got some time. If there's any additional questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And for anybody, feel free to, there's my email's right down here. Feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll try to get you a more comprehensive answer, and anything that I was only able to touch briefly on now. Give another minute or so for questions. All right, well, I thank everybody for, oh wait, here's one. What do you think about manufacturer declaration of SIL capability? What's the value? So I think that's a good question. The standard does allow, the standard has, 61508 has requirements for independence. So to claim SIL 1, you have to have an independent person. To claim SIL 2, you have to have an independent department. And to claim SIL 3, you have to have an independent organization by means of management and resources. So really claiming SIL, and then the other thing is you have to have the competency to do it. So there are many, so I think given that, it is pretty difficult for an organization to have the internal expertise that a company such as Exeter or TUV would have when they're not working on that constantly. Because there's a lot of techniques and requirements and things that are in the standard. So one, I often worry about the competency, and then two, you could only ever, if you had an independent department, which would be you're in a large organization and you've got expertise, say, in the quality department or a corporate auditing department that's reporting up very high in the organization, and I would say it would have to be outside the engineering organization to have the independence by means of funding and management. I really doubt that a company has that. So I think it really, it would be very difficult for an organization to meet the requirement of 61508 and have the competency. And the other thing is end users, our experience is end users really want an independent organization. It's not they don't trust their OEMs, it's just that, they're putting these things, safety instrument and functions are put in place to avoid things like the BP horizon or very significant events, and they want a degree of independence to have the confidence to use it. So I think it's not used that often, and most end users prefer an independent organization as opposed to a self-certification. It's different, and the standards are much different than the EMI or RFI immunity things are set up to do self-declaration. The functional safety standards are not set up to do self-declarations. All right. Well, thank you all for attending. And anything else? Have any other questions or thoughts? Shoot me an email or give me a call. I'll be happy to help you if I can. Thank you, and have a great day.